me. I pay my respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'm also presenting this work on behalf of my co-authors, and I also like to acknowledge the funding and technical expertise that went into making this work possible. A quick outline of what I'm going to talk to you today about. I'm going to introduce the virtual basin approach, the use of the virtual basin approach to assess ecosystem services, and some preliminary findings from the Cold Regions Hydrological Model, or CRIM if you hear me talk about it later. And then use of those outputs in other models of biogeochemistry and biodiversity, and then some brief next steps. So the prairies are a mosaic of landscapes. They are under different management strategies across the 3 prairie provinces. They go through wet and dry cycles, and within those wet and dry cycles, there's a high degree of interannual variability. They support critical habitat and are naturally rich in nutrients. So given the prairie-wide variability, how can we predict the future of prairie water resources? And how can we do that in a generalized way that's at a small local scale that an individual producer might work at? And how does that response vary with land management, drainage, for example, and climate change? So in order to answer those questions, we built these virtual basins. By developing a physiographic typology of the Prairie Basin, we decided on a set of scenarios focusing on wetland drainage and climate change after conversation with many of our stakeholders and partners. And then we can use that input into construct basin models using the Cold Regions Hydrological Model. And from there, we use those hydrological outputs of stream flow and surface storage and link them to other models. So again, this is the virtual basin approach is a typified basin response, and it's not specific to a particular watershed. So as I mentioned, the prairies are not so homogeneous. Jared Wolf and others built a conceptual framework identifying basically 7 different watershed classes across the prairies that would respond in similar ways to different changes. They did this through the local regional typology and land use, and put it together and informed the Cold Regions Hydrological Model. And as an output, we can use the surface water storage and movement out of the CRIM model to assess some of these changes. And mostly we're focusing on the pothole till region and the high elevation grasslands, because they're very contrasting landscapes. And the use of the virtual basin approach to understand ecosystem services. It's basically a tool to understand land use change, and later on it'll be used to understand climate change. And look at specifically how drainage scenarios impact the unique hydrology we find in the prairies. And be able to assess ecosystem services at the small scale. So some of the ecosystem services I'm going to talk to you today are in green: erosion regulation through nutrient loading, some flood prevention and regulation via storage and basin outflow, and habitat via bird abundance. Future work is going to look at carbon sequestration and water purification, as we know that wetlands are important for both of those. So this approach, what I'm going to be showing today is just preliminary, and it's likely to change because the CRIM model is still being modified to some degree. And so today I'm presenting mostly Z-score data. The base scenario, or the 0% drainage, is based off the max depressional water storage over a 30-year period from 1984 to 2017. So this doesn't take into consideration the 100 years of drainage that happened before 1984, but it's to maximize how much was stored on the land during that period. And then the drainage scenarios that we came up with, so the small to large, large to small, top to bottom, bottom to top, kind of work in a watershed basin idea. So all these wetlands are connected in a single watershed. So for example, the small to large would mean that the smallest wetland pond is drained first, then the next largest, and so on. This scenario is very similar to consolidated wetland drainage. So it's a pond or a wetland pond that keeps on getting bigger and bigger as the nearby wetlands are drained. And this is mostly the scenario that I'm going to focus on today. Similarly, the bottom to top or top to bottom are based off of the location of the wetland in the watershed. So the wetland at the very top of the basin is drained first, then so on and so forth, and then vice versa for the bottom to top. So this approach basically looks at the number and size distribution of wetlands and match that to the watershed class. So again, I'm focusing on the pothole till, so the distribution is going to match what we found in the pothole till region. We're also using 100 kilometers squared because this is basically the closest resolution we could get to the level of decision made by individual landowners and producers. We're also looking at climate forcing. So this is different than the climate scenario, so warming or precipitation changes. This is a forcing that goes through historical data and uses that to inform the model. So we have 5 locations here, and that's just a way of looking at how even within the pothole till region, there's a lot of variability across that space. So some quick results for the pothole till region. I just want to give you a quick outline of what we're looking at here. On the x-axis is the percent drained wetland, so 0% drained all the way to 100% drained. And on the y, we're looking at annual discharge in millimeters. And then across the top are the different drainage scenarios. So top to bottom, bottom to top, that's the way that that drainage works. And then along the right-hand side of the figure is the different locations that the climate forcing was used for that model. And largely we see a linear increase in discharge with increasing percent drainage. However, there are some differences due to climate forcing, so that location piece that I talked about, and the different types of drainage scenarios. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on the Yorkton climate and the small to large drainage scenario, basically because it mimics that consolidation drainage. So some quick results, changes in annual flow. So on the figure here we have on the y-axis is the percent increase in annual stream flow, and on the x is the percent drainage. And what this shows is that there's no degree of drainage that does not impact the discharge. And average flows, the yellow line there, are more highly impacted than extreme flows. You can tell by the slope of the line and the degree to which it's higher percent change. However, interannual variability and where wetlands are lost, those gatekeeper wetlands, are likely important and something we're going to consider as we move forward with this work. So that got us to all the hydrology pieces, and now how can we use those hydrology pieces to inform ecosystem services? The basin outflow that I just showed you is going to be used to estimate nutrient loading, and the wetland areas are used to estimate biodiversity and water storage. So CRIM is just a model, and it has certain assumptions about the way water is stored on the landscape. And in this case, the CRIM looks at it as a uniform depth across the hydrological response unit. And in order to get that to be more realistic and comparable to real wetlands, I modified that using the Hayashi-Vanderkamp relationship for distributions. And then that way, we are actually looking at more of what a pond would look like instead of just a uniform depth. So the Prairie Biodiversity model, well, some background here. I don't actually need to tell you this because I know all of you know this, but the wetlands are biodiversity hotspots in the prairies. Heterogeneous conditions lead to maximum biodiversity. So when we drain things, that things become more homogeneous. And we know that drainage today has led to significant habitat loss. And we know that the benefits of wetland consolidation, as in increasing wetland areas, may be biased towards certain species tolerant of reduced habitat heterogeneity, and also towards species that prefer conditions like lakes. So some of the results here, I'm using that wetland area that's generated by CRIM. So the figure here on the left is wetland loss across the X, and pond or wetland HRU Z-score on the Y. And what we can see as the wetland loss increases, the individual wetland areas tend to increase. So we're getting bigger and bigger wetlands. However, the figure on the right shows the same wetland loss across the bottom, but the summed area, you can see that the total area decreases because we're losing those individual wetlands, even though some of them are getting a lot larger. So this was work that was done by Bob Clark based on models that were built by Crystal Mantica-Pringle and others, published in 2019. And again, on the x-axis is the percent drained, and on the y is the model predicted bird abundance. Just a note on this work, it's still in progress, and this initial run of this particular model excludes most duck species. And so future generations of this model will include those species. And despite linear decreases in total pond area that I just showed you, bird abundance is less linear. For example, if we decrease bird or wetland area or if we can increase wetland drainage to 30%, we're actually losing about 50% of the predicted bird abundance, which is significant. Moving on to the ecosystem service of storing water on the landscape, wetlands add to a basin's storage capacity, so that's the volume that can be held within the basin. And when we drain those wetlands, we reduce the capacity of the landscape to hold that water and increase the efficiency and lower the threshold for water running off the fields and reducing detention storage. And importantly, how drainage influences flood frequency and severity will depend on different factors, including precipitation and climate, like I showed you, so that variability there, the structure of the basin, and how those wetlands are drained. So some results here. So this is using the same data as the biodiversity, as the pond area, or the pond volume in this case. And on the x-axis is the percent area drained, and on the y is the total pond volume of z-score per year. And this is the total maximum pond volume in all undrained ponds added together. And as you can see with wetland loss, wetland storage decreases fairly proportionally. In other drainage scenarios, so again, this is the small to large drainage scenario, they may show different trends because of those gatekeeper wetlands. We also need to look at some interannual variability, because this is over the historical climate. We can look at like wet and dry periods and how that might change the maximum storage. Jumping into some prairie nutrient loading. In general, we see the greater discharge volumes with discharge drainage of wetlands. I've shown you that through some of the outputs so far. And nutrient concentrations in the prairies typically remain constant or increase with increasing flow. So when we increase that discharge, we expect that nutrient loads are also going to be increasing. And that can really be a function of increased soil erosion and nutrient transport. This is also caused by more frequent and intense high flow events. The degree to which high interannual variation in nutrient loading still needs to be explored, but we know that, for example, wetter periods are going to have a more pronounced effect than drier periods. And as I mentioned earlier, wetlands we know are significant kidneys of the prairies. They filter our water, and that's something that we're hoping to take into consideration by building another separate model that's connected to these, to look at how wetlands can process some of these nutrients. For some results here, this is again just the discharge, because that's what's being used to estimate the nutrient loading. On the y-axis, we have the basin outflow, so that's the z-score per year, and then on the x is the percent area drained. And as you can see, there is typically an increase, but it's less linear than what we would expect. And that's a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a high degree of interannual variability. And yeah, so then this discharge was used to estimate nutrient loading. So the way I did that was taking assumed concentration of stream nutrients or stream total phosphorus in some prairie pothole or the pothole till streams, and basically use that as a relationship for the nutrient loading as a constant relationship. And basically this projection results in a nearly 200% increase in total phosphorus loading from a 0 to 100% wetland loss because of that increase in basin outflow discharge. We do need to look at more into the impact of interannual variability, and we know that it does play a role in TP, but to what degree needs to be explored a little bit further. And the other part that needs to is, as we're draining, we're changing the contributing area, and we know that some of those changes might only happen at a scale greater than the 100 kilometers squared that we're looking at here. So that's something that also, when we think about upscaling this work, needs to be considered. Also, so jumping into some preliminary findings, using these virtual basin approach, we can give us some much needed estimates of current and future change in small basins. We know that discharge is more, average years are being more severely impacted by that drainage. Nutrient loading is increasing, water storage is decreasing, and there's a large impact of drainage on wetland bird abundance. And this is likely underestimated in this analysis due to the exclusion of obligate wetland species. Obviously, more work needs to be done, expand our biodiversity model, include ducks, and provide some uncertainty estimates around some of these linked models. I've shown you what we know, integrated what we know from many disciplines to create a tool that helps us understand these effects, and I hopefully can inform some decision making. I'd be happy to discuss what we've done, and I'm curious to hear what types of scenarios you might be interested in other than those that I've presented, and whether this can help inform your work or efforts to model change at larger scales. You can give me I'd be happy to answer questions now, or you can shoot me an email. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. It looks like we do have time for some questions. So if you have a question, please either type your name in the chat box and then I'll call on you to unmute your microphone, or if you'd like, please type your question in the chat box and I can read it out to Emily to answer. I'll give everybody a minute here to type some questions in if they have some.